In the tumultuous era of post-Civil War America, the fate of a nation hangs in the balance. On February 24th, 1868, Andrew Johnson is impeached. When the Civil War breaks out in 1861, Johnson, a Tennessean, is the only U.S. senator from a seceding state who remains loyal to the Union. In 1864, he is elected vice president for Lincoln's second term. He becomes president after Lincoln's assassination in 1865. Johnson does not see eye to eye with the Republican-dominated Congress, which is pushing Reconstruction policies. Johnson frequently vetoes bills passed by Congress, and Congress in turn frequently overrides his vetoes by a two-thirds vote. Johnson removes Edwin Stanton as Secretary of War. This violates the 1867 Tenure of Office Act and is the last straw for House Republicans. They approve 11 articles of impeachment, 9 of which relate directly to Stanton's removal. In May, the Senate falls one vote short of the two-thirds majority needed to remove Johnson. Only 2 presidents since Johnson have been impeached, Clinton and Trump. Like Johnson, they were both acquitted by the Senate. Stay tuned, because coming up, we're going to learn more about Johnson's impeachment, and we're going to tackle that question: should he have even been impeached? Also, we're going to analyze Johnson's presidency and look at what he accomplished as president, and also where does he rank compared to other presidents in U.S. history. We'll also learn a bit about what happened to Johnson after his presidency. Don't forget to check out Today in History in my Teachers Pay Teachers store. There's a link in the description. All right, let's get to this. So vetoes, all right? Johnson had 21 vetoes, 15 of which were overridden with that two-thirds majority by Congress. He also had 8 pocket vetoes, which is where you just refuse to sign the bill until that session of Congress essentially ends and it times out, and so it can't be even overridden. So he used that pocket veto as well 8 different times. This surprised me a little bit because there's always talk about all those vetoes of Andrew Johnson. We'll get to that in a minute. But first, let's talk more about this Tenure of Office Act of 1867. Now, this was passed not long before it was used against Johnson in his impeachment. And it was really only passed by Congress to try to get Johnson. Let's be honest. Johnson Johnson vetoed this legislation initially, and it was one of those that was overridden by Congress. But Congress hates Johnson, and so they want to use this against him. And of course, they get the opportunity because in the cabinet are the holdovers from Lincoln, and they disagree with Johnson on basically everything. But what this Tenure of Office Act requires is it requires not just Senate approval for a new cabinet member, but it requires Senate approval to remove a cabinet member. And so Johnson, technically, now with this act in place, can't remove anybody, but he decides to do it anyway and tries to remove Stanton, and then that's what creates this whole impeachment crisis. Interestingly, though, there's a lot of questions as to whether this would even be a constitutional law in the first place, because it's stepping on that, separation of powers. Does not the president have control over the executive branch? And how much does Congress really have a say in all of that? And interestingly, the act has since been repealed, first partially and then fully. This was both of those times in the late 19th century. And then the Supreme Court went so far in 1926 to declare it unconstitutional. So I guess that question's answered. Let's talk about the Senate trial a bit more. So Johnson is actually kept away from the proceedings by his lawyers. They do not want him in there because there's such an antagonistic relationship between him and Congress that they're concerned that he's going to have some temper tantrums and outbursts in there, and that will affect the vote of senators who might otherwise not vote to remove him from office. And of course, it's the Senate that ultimately determines whether a president stays in office after the House has impeached. It's one of those big misunderstandings where people think impeachment means removal from office. It does not technically mean that. It means it's a big step in that direction, but the House impeaches, which is bringing those charges, but then it's the Senate that has to decide whether or not to remove the person. And by just one vote, he's not removed. Let's look at Johnson in history. How does he rank as a president? Well, let me give you my thoughts on that. He was a terrible president. I mean, like beyond terrible. He's one of the worst we've ever had. I don't think there's much debate about that. I guess the only debate is he at the very bottom or just really close to it? When you look at historians that have been surveyed on this, they almost without fail put him close to the bottom. He's right down there with the other bottom dwellers like Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, Warren G. Harding. These guys, it's just like a group of real winners when it comes to the presidency. And where is Johnson in all of that? Take your pick. He's down there in the rinks in the 40s somewhere. All right. Why? Well, he's really ineffective. Okay. And just in the most basic way, he has zero ability to work with Congress. And you can certainly blame some of that on Congress, but ultimately you're the president of the United States and you can't find a way at all to work with Congress. A lot of that has to sit with you. He also blocks a lot of legislation that I think people, especially today, would feel like, wow, this is pretty common sense stuff. And quite frankly, your policies are not just wrong, but just absolutely racist when it comes to Andrew Johnson. I mean, he blocks just about everything he can related to Reconstruction. He vetoed 20 different Reconstruction bills. He urges the Southern legislatures to reject the 14th Amendment, which gives some very important basic rights to all Americans and especially to African Americans. The U.S. Army was settling black families on lands in the South, and he orders some of these black families to be evicted from these lands. He's a terrible president. There's no question about that. But the other question is, should he have been impeached? Well, as bad as he was, the Constitution says high crimes and misdemeanors. That's what it takes for you to be impeached. And ultimately, I feel like most of Johnson's issues were policy differences more than they were high crimes and misdemeanors. The Constitution doesn't allow you to remove a president because the president's terrible at his job. That's just not how it works. High crimes and misdemeanors, I don't think that fits with Johnson. And so ultimately, it probably would have been a bad thing for the country, as crazy as that sounds. Maybe in the short term it would have felt good, but overall, I don't think a good thing to remove a president in that circumstance, as bad a president as he was. Okay, so what did he accomplish anything as president? Well, his biggest accomplishment, you'd have to say, is the 1867 purchase of Alaska from Russia, which he was president at the time. I think most of the credit goes to Secretary of State William Seward, and rightfully so. So I don't even know how much of the credit we can give to Johnson on this one, but technically, kudos to Johnson. He was president when this happened. And at first, of course, this is lampooned as Seward's folly, but it has absolutely turned out to be worth it. No question about that. Alaska was a bargain, an absolute bargain, and a great move. So we'll give Johnson a little credit for that. One little interesting side note on this, Seward really didn't want Alaska for maybe the reasons that we, of course, enjoy having Alaska today. Seward kind of secretly is hoping that it will give him an opportunity and give the United States an opportunity to absorb Canada. And Alaska positions him to try to do this. The only problem is Britain outflanks him on this, because just a few months after the purchase of Alaska, Britain decides to give Canada home rule. Okay? Now, most of this was in the works anyway. So I don't know how much the purchase of Alaska directly affected the granting of home rule to Canada a few months later in 1867. But regardless, Seward cannot really make any direct effort at Canada now, because any direct attempt at Canada, it feels like an invasion of now sovereign land. You can no longer make the claim that you're freeing Canada from British tyranny. And so that didn't work out the way Seward was hoping. All right, so after his presidency, what happens with Johnson? Johnson does try to run in 1868. Now, he's not running on the Republican ticket because they want nothing to do with him, and he never technically was a Republican anyway. Grant is their candidate. But it's he runs for the nomination. He loses to New York Governor Horatio Seymour, and then, of course, Seymour goes on to lose to Grant in the general election. And really, this is one of the biggest, for me, sad moments in history, because you know what? If Seymour had won, we would have had a real rival for the best facial hair in presidential history. He would be right up there with that amazing neck beard of his with Martin Van Buren, who still easily holds, in my opinion, the position of best presidential facial hair. But if Seymour had won in 1868, he could give Van Buren a run for his money. All right. After his presidency, Andrew Johnson goes back to Tennessee. He runs for Senate, loses that bid in 1869. He runs for the House of Representatives, loses that bid in 1872. This guy, he wants to vindicate himself, and he wants to get back at Congress for what they did to him. And so he's trying to get himself back into Congress. Eventually, in 1875, he is elected to the Senate from the state of Tennessee and is sworn in March of 1875. Now, if these dates seem weird, like why is he running for Senate in 1875 and sworn in March? Well, that's how it used to be. Remember, state legislatures back then picked senators. And a lot of times they didn't do that until January. So it's not like the election of the House or the president that had to happen the previous November. For the Senate, the state legislatures often didn't do that till January. And then, of course, you weren't inaugurated until March back then. So anyway, he gets in the Senate. He gets a pretty cool reception from a lot of the senators. A few of them, even his former rivals, at least go shake his hand. But there's no love here, okay? But it's interesting because this makes Andrew Johnson the only former president ever to serve in the United States Senate. And he joins a pretty small group of former presidents who have held any kind of important position within the federal government. You have John Quincy Adams, who was elected to the House after his presidency. You have John Tyler, who is not elected to the U.S. Congress, but is elected to the Confederate Congress after his presidency, although he never technically gets there because he dies before he was inaugurated. And then you have William Howard Taft, who is named Chief Justice of the United States after his presidency. So really, technically, it's just Adams and Johnson who were ever elected to federal office, and just Taft, who, along with them, serves in a major federal position. Kind of interesting. Well, Andrew Johnson's time in the Senate is rather short because he suffers a stroke in late July. This is just a few months after taking office, and then he dies in early August. And that is the end of Andrew Johnson. If you liked what you've seen here today, please like and subscribe to Learn with Mr. Lewis. Oh, and there's a great video you can watch here and another one right here. Thanks.